Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's 2-hour Zoom call for the 2025 Intern program. Our speaker and presenter today is Matt March. Matt is the County Extension Agent for Waller County, which is over in the Hempstead area. Those of you that don't know the local geography that's here. We're going to let Matt further his own bio to you in just a minute. Just a couple of quick announcements. One, using the oft-used expression out of an abundance of caution, we've decided to cancel or postpone at least the geology walk today at the Montgomery County Preserve. It's wet there now, and it looks like it's going to be worse by the time noon comes. So just know we will cancel and find in the program additional 2 hours to provide for folks later in the session. So consider that canceled. You should also get an email from Virginia this morning confirming that. So you get 2 hours back this afternoon. You can read ahead in your book, perhaps. The other, just for folks that have joined later, put your real name in the chat so we can get you marked off as being here and getting credit for the 2 hours that we're going to have. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. Everyone will be muted. If you have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll take a break ever so often and field those questions for you. So it's all yours, Matt.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. I guess first thing we need to do is figure out how to get my slides up there. It says y'all are still disabling me from sharing. There we go. All right. Y'all should be seeing my slides then. All right. Yeah. All right. So, like Michael said, my name is Matthew March. I am the extension agent for here in Waller County. Today, I'm going to be covering the Texas ecoregions, or kind of the ecological sections of y'all's training or y'all's textbook. And the ecoregions talk is kind of a passion of mine. I do a lot of wildlife and natural resource management talks, and that's kind of my niche in extension. And I also I enjoy giving this talk, and I think it's kind of interesting, especially for y'all that maybe haven't traveled a lot through Texas, or maybe you have traveled through Texas and never really thought about it. But we have a lot of different landscapes and geography and plants and animals, and it varies from which part of the state you're at, which you can, I mean, size has a lot to do with that. But this talk kind of goes over a lot of the differences you see throughout the state, and the reasons why. And I do this by showing a lot of pictures. And I hope after this slide you're kind of like me. I kind of nerd out on this stuff. When I'm driving around Texas, I got to know what ecoregion I'm in, so I end up kind of trying to figure that out to see what's supposed to be there and what's not supposed to be there. And I think that's also important to understand as y'all are taking y'all's Master Naturalist trainees class and becoming certified Master Naturalists, that a lot of what we see in Texas isn't historically what used to be there or what it should look like. And I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions out there of what's natural or what the landscape should look like compared to what it should. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And like, if y'all have any questions, like they said, just type them in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. All right, so y'all should be seeing my big screen. If I'm not, y'all just say something and interrupt me. I don't know why it flipped on me like that, but okay. All right, so Texas ecoregions. So the first part of this presentation, we're going to go over a lot of the definitions of what an ecoregion is. Sorry about that, y'all. What an ecoregion is, And after that, then we're going to kind of define what the ecoregion is and kind of I guess you could say the science behind it. And then after that, we're going to have the fun part of the presentation, which is where we're going to take a road trip basically across Texas. And I'm going to show you a lot of different pictures of the different ecoregions. So what is an ecoregion? Well, I'm not going to read all these to y'all, but here's some different definitions of what an ecoregion is. And you can look, depending on the source, kind of varies as far as the definition. So if you're, a good example would be if you're a geologist, your ecoregion is going to be more based on lightness or rocks. So an ecoregion is basically an area of light things. So a biologist is going to look at an ecoregion more as a standpoint of an area with similar plants or similar animals. A hydrologist is maybe going to look more of an ecoregion that's based off of similar watershed characteristics. And then maybe like a climatologist would look at an ecoregion more as an area that has similar climate. So maybe like something next to the ocean would have similar characteristics compared to something next out, 500 miles from the ocean where the ocean's not driving that climate. So again, here's just some various definitions. So I kind of touched on some of these already. But the different drivers of ecoregion are temperature, precipitation, soil, hydrology, geography, altitude, microclimate, and oceans. And those are kind of the big ones. There's a lot more that drive ecoregions, but these are the main ones we're going to focus on today. Are y'all seeing like the little screen? Let me see if I can switch this over. Oh, sorry about that. All right. Okay, so our different ecoregions, these are our drivers of our different ecoregions. And as you can see, I bolded temperature and precipitation. And for today's talk, that's going to be kind of the two things I want y'all to focus in on. We're going to talk about geography some. We're going to talk about how elevation affects the climate, especially out in West Texas in the desert. But for the most part, we're going to focus on temperature and precipitation. And the reasoning for that is Texas is big and we have very big different temperature and precipitation gradients depending on where you are in the state. And that tends to be our major driver of ecoregions. So precipitation in Texas. Here's a map of the precipitation gradient in Texas. And I'm sure y'all know this, but just to kind of review this, as you go from east to west, you get drier. So, and y'all are basically based out of Montgomery and Walker County. So y'all are on the eastern side of the state, which is going to be kind of right about north of Houston, about right there. But y'all can you can even get wetter as you go further east towards Beaumont and southeast Texas. So you can see the gradient in Texas goes from around 60 inches in deep southeast Texas all the way to less than 8 inches out in El Paso. And as you can imagine, that has a huge impact on our plants and what we can grow. And that's going to have an impact on our animals, which is going to kind of base on what our ecoregions are. And something we don't think about maybe quite as much in Texas because it's either drought or flood it tends to be. But next week is going to be a perfect example of this, is going to be the temperature gradient we have. So it's kind of makes sense. But the further north you go in the state, the colder it's going to get. The further south you go, the warmer it's going to get. But when you actually look at that as kind of from an ecological standpoint, our plants and animals up in the panhandle almost have to be adapted to not even just a temperate, but almost a subtemperate climate, which means basically it can get really cold compared to down in the valley, down around Brownsville, where that's actually a subtropical climate where it might go years without freezing. So here is what we call a USD hardiness zone map, and I think they updated this one since I did this presentation, so the colors have probably migrated a little bit north. But basically the whole point of this map is it tells you how cold it can potentially get during the winter. And so you should be able to plant plants that are adapted to that temperature. If not, you maybe have to take some kind of action to protect them. So for y'all that are master gardeners also, or might be interested in gardening, this is something that us as extension agents give out a lot of times to gardeners or people that are planting crops, because you need to understand how cold it can potentially get. So if we look at the very top of the panhandle, they're in what we call USDA hardiness zone 6A, which means that it can potentially get down to -5 to -10 degrees during the winter. On the flip side of that, down in 9B, down in deep South Texas, 30 to 25 degrees, so barely below freezing. So you can see that has a huge impact on our temperature gradient. And again, obviously that's going to affect our plants and our animals. And I think next week is going to be a great example of this. I saw on Tuesday, the highs in the panhandle are supposed to be 3 degrees compared to 89 down in Brownsville. So you can see that this map is in play next week. Another thing I like to point out, and this is just kind of a side note from EcoRegions, you can see that y'all in Walker in Montgomery County are kind of in that 8A, more 8B range, which means you should be able to, your plants should be able to withstand down to 20 to 15 degrees. So next week when they're calling for low 20s and everybody's freaking out that this is, yes, it's going to be well below normal for our average low, but going to be saying, well, this is well out of range of normal. No, it is not. It is not uncommon to see freezes down in Southeast Texas down to the mid to low teens. Is that normal year to year? No, but does it happen? Yes. So that's just something to keep in mind on a side note if y'all are looking into planting stuff for gardening. So enough on that. We're going to move on to, if I was in person, I kind of ask questions during this part of the presentation, but I won't do that since for sake of not having all y'all chime in on Zoom. But I would ask y'all, what is Texas? So think about this. And when you put this into a map of the United States, are we in the southern United States? Are we in the Southwest? Are we part of the West? Are we part of the Midwest? And that's kind of, Texas is kind of doesn't fit in any of those. So when I give this talk, a lot of times it's to master naturalists kind of in the Southeast Texas area. So they tend to say the South or the Southeast, which makes sense. But if you were talking to a group out, let's say in El Paso, they're probably going to say the Southwest or even the Western United States. Compare that to if you ask this question to people up north of Amarillo, like in Dalehart, they actually have a lot more similarities to the Midwest. And some people actually associate Texas with the Midwest up there, surprisingly. And that kind of makes sense. Farming communities, a lot of wheat is grown, very agricultural society. They get a lot of big snow and ice storms. So when I ask what Texas is, it's really like no other state in the lower 48. Well, really, I guess in the United States in general, because one, we're so big, we tend to spend a lot across a lot of temperature and precipitations and such ecoregions, but also just where we are in the United States, where our northern part is a lot to do with the Midwest or the middle part of the country. Our eastern part is more similar to the Southeast, and our western part is more similar to the West. So we really don't fit into any mold there. And with that concept, when you look at a map of the biomes of the world, and I'm not going to go into biomes, but basically when you think of biomes, biomes are just ecoregions on a very large scale. So an area of light climate. And a good example of this would be, you can see kind of the bluish, lightest bluish, kind of greenish colors in the northern parts of the globe are tundra biomes. So it's areas that are Arctic, basically. So that's kind of when you think of a biome, an area of like things. So you can think of the Arctic, the tundra. So when you look at Texas on this map, it's kind of hard to tell because we're zoomed out pretty far. But you can see Texas has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. According to this source, Texas has 6 different biomes, 6 different major biomes in the state alone. And you looking at this map, there's roughly, I guess, about 20 different biomes in the world, and we have 6 of those here in Texas. So that's pretty impressive if you think about it. And then, I mean, that's way more than most countries, unless you're a very big country like Russia or China. That's definitely way more than any other state in the lower 48. So here's just another map. This is a different source, so the biomes are a little bit different, but it's basically the same. So you can see Texas, we have mixed forest in the south, in the east. That's going to be our pine trees. You move a little bit west of that, you get that eastern deciduous forest, which is your oaks and your hardwoods. Which, yes, if you're around College Station, our forests are different than, let's say, the forest around New York. But when you look at a very large scale, our hardwood diversity in the tree species and just kind of how the ecoregion works, there isn't much difference between the eastern deciduous forest in Texas compared to that on maybe parts of Virginia, New York, stuff like that. Then obviously, as we move further west, we get into the plains, and then out west is desert for the most part. But if you can see, there's a little blue dot out there in West Texas, and that is actually kind of part of the Rocky Mountain evergreen forest biome. It kind of depends. Some people call that kind of just higher altitudes in the desert, but we actually have some mountain ranges out in West Texas that actually have almost all their similarities are similar to what you see in the Rocky Mountains. So with all that being said, Texas is home to at least 4 major biomes, or Texas is home to multiple major biomes. And I'm going to go back real quick here. It'll let me. When you look at the biomes that are not in Texas, it's really the ones that we find in the far north and then in the far west along the western coast. So that would include chaparral, which would be kind of what we see in California, like where all the wildfires have occurred lately. That would be your chaparral ecoregion. Coastal forest, which would be the Pacific Northwest, so Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. We obviously don't have the true tropical biomes like you'd see down in Mexico and around Panama. But like I said, down in deep South Texas, we do have some subtropical characteristics. Then obviously we don't have the boreal or the Arctic, which you find in the northern latitudes of Canada and Alaska. But again, if you've ever heard kind of, there's this saying that Texas is like it's its own country. We like to boast how we're better than all the other states. Well, when it comes down to ecoregions, it really is, because there's no other state in Texas that you can find the biomes of deciduous forest, grassland, desert, and montane forest all in one state. So we have all these different biomes which relate to a lot of different ecoregions. And I probably need to touch on real quick what a montane forest is. That's basically going to be a evergreen forest, so pine trees, basically, or cedars, that are found high in elevation in mountain or high in latitude regions. So we're looking out again in West Texas, where we actually have some mountains where the elevation gets high enough that the temperature gets cool enough, and we get enough precipitation to support evergreen forest. And in Texas, that's going to be mostly ponderosa and pinyon pines with a little bit of Douglas fir mixed in. So I've kind of touched on this already, but as we go through our road trip of Texas here in a little bit, I want y'all to follow these general trends that we're going to see. As we go east to west across Texas, we're going to go from pine forest, which y'all should be very familiar with being in Montgomery County, as y'all are on that western edge of that pine belt, to deciduous forest, which is basically going to be our most hardiest oak trees here in Texas, post oaks. We're going to lose the oak trees, we're going to lose the pine trees and some of the bigger hardwoods, but we're still going to have some of them oak trees. Then we're going to go into our grasslands, which are going to be tall grass prairie, midgrass prairie, short grass prairie. And when we look at that, all that means is as we get drier, we have less precipitation. So the amount of vegetation we can grow on our grasslands are going to decrease. So if I was in person and standing, I would show you a tall grass prairie in a normal year could potentially reach waist to shoulder high. So around 4 feet in high, if not taller. A mid-grass prairie is going to be around knee to waist high, so about 1.5 to 2.5, 3 feet. And a short grass prairie is areas where we see like less than 20 inches of rain, less than 15 inches of rain or so. And you're going to see anywhere between 4 to 8 inches of height. So that's basically the difference between a short grass, tall grass, and a mid-grass prairie. And then when we get out to that far west Texas area, we get into our desert areas. And then our ecoregions, and you'll kind of see this on the map on the next slide, they kind of tend to go east to west. There's not really a north to south difference so much, but we do see kind of a difference in plants and animals that are more adapted to sub-freezing temperatures in the north and those that are adapted to tropical climates in the south. So that's just something else to take note of. So here's a picture of our ecoregions of Texas. There is a ton of different maps depending on your source, but gold seems to be kind of the standard, and I believe that's the one that y'all are using in your textbook. So that's the one that I'm going to go through today for y'all. And honestly, I don't even know how many are off of the top of my head, but I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I believe 10 different ecoregions defined by y'all's textbook. Depending on the source, that can be a lot higher. Some of them go up to 30 ecoregions. Some of them go a little less than 10. But this is probably about the most sound one as far as broad habitats and ecoregions. When we get to the end of this slide, if there's time, I'm actually going to jump into a different ecoregion map that actually goes into way more detail. And we're going to focus in that just specifically on y'all's Montgomery and Walker County. But for now, we're just going to look at golds. So as we take our road trip across Texas, based off the previous map, we're going to go east to west across the Gould's ecoregions. And I want y'all to look at, and I'm going to talk about it. We're first going to talk about characteristics. So what's some of the land use we historically saw? What do we see now? And then some of the special characteristics that I just want y'all to be made aware of. And then what I think the more fun part of the presentation is, we're going to look at pictures of the landscape and the geography, and then some of the plants and animals you can find in these ecoregions. And then I can go on and on, so I'm going to try to stay on track, but I'm going to talk about some of the side notes about some of the management and habitat concerns we're having with some of these animals and plants in these ecoregions. So before I continue, I'm going to take a quick water break. And then, Michael, do we have any questions on the chat? If not, I'll just keep on rolling. Or if y'all want to ask a question, now would be a good time before we jump into the next section.
We don't have any in the chat, but if somebody would want to come off mute and ask a question, now's a good time.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep on rolling. And like I said, this is the funner part of the presentation, I think. So we're going to start off in the east. This is what in slang, or I guess I shouldn't say slang, our nickname for the first ecoregion we're going to talk about is the Piney Woods. That is actually kind of a Texas name for this ecoregion. When you actually look at a larger scale of the United States ecoregions, or how us as biologists or land managers kind of define different parts of the country, this is really the western end of the coastal plain of the southern United States. But it's that pine belt that extends all the way from basically the Atlantic coast to the western part of East Texas. So either way, so when we look at the Piney Woods, it's going to be the green color on this map, and it starts up in the northeast of the state there in Bowie County, and that's basically Texarkana, which is right on the edge. It then kind of goes southwest across a bunch of them little bitty tiny counties in northeast Texas that are about the size of Conroe. And then it goes down to Smith County, which is going to be Tyler. So if any of y'all ever been around Tyler's right on the edge of the Piney Woods ecoregion. And then it farms basically up to the Trinity, continues southwest to the Trinity River there north of Huntsville. Crockett there in Houston County would also be on the edge of. If you go west of Crockett, you get more into Post Oak. If you go east, you get into the Piney Woods. And then you can see it continues down just right to the western edge of Walker and Montgomery County into northern Harris County. So really that Harris Montgomery County line is really about where you start transitioning out of the piney woods, and then it goes east on over into Beaumont, and then like I said, the whole Pineywood ecoregion basically extends throughout Louisiana, southern Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, northern parts of Florida, Georgia, eastern parts of South Carolina, North Carolina, even up into parts of Virginia and Maryland. So again, the piney woods we see here in Texas, we like to say it's our own piney woods, but it's really just that far western extension of that pine belt that really extends all the way up to basically Washington, D.C. In the Atlantic coast. But back to Texas, we'll go ahead. One thing to point out, I guess, since we're on this slide here, Montgomery County actually has 3 different ecoregions in it, but they barely touch on the western edge of it, basically. Same with Walker County also, and that's going to be that gray color, which is the Blackland Prairie, and that kind of brownish color, which is the Post Oak Savanna, which we'll talk about here in a little bit in our next ecoregions. But just to point out that if y'all reside around Montgomery, not Montgomery County, but the town of Montgomery, when you go west on 105 out of Conroe, once you get around Montgomery, you're actually transitioning out of the piney woods into that Blackland Prairie ecoregion. And then if you go kind of southwest out of Montgomery County or northwest out of Walker County, either into Madisonville or towards Hempstead, you're actually transitioning over to the Post Oak Savanna. So just something to keep in note.
Matt, we did have a one quick request.
Yes.
The 2 slides before the one you just had.
Yes.
You could go back to those real quick. I think somebody wanted to just look or check that one and the one before.
This one here.
More time. Yeah. Yeah, back 2 more. There.
That one?
That one, and then the next 2. I think they wanted to see that quickly. That's good right there. Now you can flip through.
All right, just flip through.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. And I know I'm throwing a lot of information at y'all, so I just want to kind of tell y'all about the diversity we have in the state. I don't expect y'all to remember all this for sure, but that's why y'all are trainees, so y'all can look this up in y'all's book and review it. So we're going to talk about the piney woods now. So again, we already mentioned it's that extension of the southern pine belt. It's generally rolling to level. So down around the southern end of it, like where we are in Conroe, it's fairly level and flat. You get up there around Tyler and Marshall and kind of in the northeast part of the pine belt, it's actually fairly rolling. And there's actually some, I wouldn't say significant hills up there, but the hills are steep enough, they'll take your breath away if you're walking around them, hiking around. One thing to note, the piney woods is one of the few ecoregions in the state that we have very sandy, well, we have sandy soils in a lot of parts of the state, but we have sandy soils in the piney woods, but we have acidic soils in the piney woods. That's unique to the piney woods. Most of our other ecoregions don't have acidic soils. In fact, they're alkaline, so they have a positive pH on the pH scale. If I was in person, I'd ask y'all to kind of guess what that is, but I'll just give y'all a minute to think. Why do the rest of the state tend to have positive soils or tend to have alkaline soils? Well, you think about what's found a lot around Austin and San Antonio in the mid parts of the state. We have a lot of limestone. Limestone's not acidic. That limestone erodes into the soil and it makes it alkaline. If any of y'all are gardeners, that's the reason why we add lime to our gardens, to reverse the negative pH we have around here. But with that being said, if I had any gardeners in the group, y'all would know that sandy and acidic soils, for the most part, unless you're trying to grow blueberries or some kind of specialty crop that likes that kind of soil, sandy and acidic soils doesn't grow very good crops. So with that being said, most of the piney woods remain forest land. we do have some cropland up around the Red River and the Trinity River bottom, but it's very limited. But even though we have forest land, and most of the pine woods is still a forest land, it's not what it used to look like. So historically, it would have been what we would have had pine savannas and hardwood forest bottoms. So along the major river bottoms, Trinity, Sabine, Natchez, stuff like that, we would have had these large hardwood bottomland forests. And on the upland areas, like around Conroe, you would have had what we would have had a pine savanna, where it would have been a more open forest where you could see through it. The understory wouldn't be overgrowing, and it would have looked a lot different than it did now. A lot of our forests have been altered. They haven't been managed right, or they're being managed for loblolly and shortleaf pine plantations for commercial timber growth. Now, with that being said, there's a trend going on right now, and it's increasing every year, is to go back to more of these plantation or more of these historical pine savannas, away from these plantation systems, because these pine savannas actually produce larger and straighter logs, which make power line poles, which are more valuable than trees in a plantation system that we use to make dimensional lumber or plywood. But either way, here's a picture of kind of the piney woods, and I don't need to, y'all live in this part of the state, but the picture on the left is from Angelina National Forest, and that's a kind of more of a pine savanna type ecosystem. It hadn't been burned in a few years, so fire maintains our pine savannas. So this is probably a system of forest that hadn't been burned for about 5 years, and the Angelina National Forest is south of Lufkin. But again, you can see that's more of a pine savanna. How many of y'all driving around the loop around Conroe see forest that looks like this, where you can look into 300 yards easily? No, you see an overgrown forest full of yaupon and beautyberry and everything else. So that is not what our piney woods should look like. On a side note, a savanna like in this picture is way more fire resilient and can manage a wildfire a lot better, because we can easily put that out compared to a thick yaupon understory, which is going to allow that flame to get up into the tops of the pine trees. The picture on the right is Caddo Lake. Some of y'all might be familiar with that. That is going to be Texas's only natural lake, and I put that in quotation marks for 2 reasons. And Caddo Lake is located in northeast Texas on the Louisiana border, north of Marshall. I put in quotations, it's our only natural lake, because we do have other natural lakes. They just don't really get up to that, I guess, standard of being a lake. So we have oxbow ponds, we have wetlands that hold water. I mean, those are natural wetlands, natural lakes. But Caddo Lake, back in like the 1800s, was formed by a log jam, basically a bunch of dead logs floating down the Red River in Louisiana that clogged up the Red River, and it backed the water up into Caddo Lake, which is a tributary of the Red River. At some point, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, for navigational purposes and flood control, came along and knocked down that log jam. Hence, Caddo Lake started to drain. So they built a little dam. I think it's only like 3 or 4 feet tall. It's not a very big earthen dam, basically. It's not a very tall spillway. But there is a man-made structure now retaining the water in Caddo Lake. So it's really not a natural lake anymore. It was farmed naturally, but per the case, man came in there and altered it. So here is just some pictures of some of the unique wildlife we can find here in the piney woods. So I'm going to go, I always do this differently and I get myself confused. I'll start in the top left and we'll go clockwise. So the top left is going to be our red cockaded woodpecker. This is a protected species that's found in East Texas and across the South. And the reason why it's protected is it requires old pine trees that we typically find in these pine savannas to nest, because it doesn't make its own cavity to nest in. So basically, it doesn't drill a hole for its nest for its babies, it requires these old trees that have natural cavities to nest in. So that's going to be our red cockaded woodpecker. Kind of a good conservation success story. Their numbers have steadily increased over the last few decades, and I think, I can't ever remember, they've either been proposed or they have now been officially downgraded from endangered to threatened. So the population's actually going in the right direction. The bad thing is most of the populations are actually found on government land or protected land in national forest or state forest, with only a few colonies on private land. So then we move over to the right side. That's going to be a paddlefish, which is just kind of a unique fish. It's protected in Texas, but it's actually a game fish in other states like Kansas and the Midwest, and states in the Midwest. It's native to the Mississippi River drainage, basically. So it's only found in a handful of drainages, kind of in northeast part of Texas that actually drain into the Mississippi River. But the paddlefish, you can say that kind of looks like a prehistoric fish, which it is. So what it does is it actually uses that big mouth of it to open up, and you would think it would eat, like, I don't know, a big fish or something like that, but it actually strains the water for algae and other little microscopic plants and animals, and eats that. It catches it in its gills. It actually has very similar function to a whale that strains krill out in the ocean. They are actually, if you ever eat caviar, it maybe if it came from a paddlefish. A lot of our local caviar that's produced in the United States is actually harvested from paddlefish. So like I said, you can't harvest them here in Texas, but in other states where the population is higher, they actually have a commercial season where, I mean, nobody eats them for meat purposes. They harvest them for caviar. And we're really not sure what the big rostrum, so the big nose basically on the paddlefish, is used for. It's believed it has a bunch of like electroreceptors in it, so it's believed it probably uses that to kind of detect the microscopic animals in the water, but we're really not 100% sure. So we go to bottom right. That's going to be the Louisiana pine snake. That is going to be probably one of our more endangered species across the entirety of the state. It is a subspecies of the bull snake, but it's its own subspecies, and it's, like I said, Louisiana pine snake. And it's actually found in only a handful. I think the last time they did a comprehensive survey, like less than 7 populations or colonies in Sabine National Forest and 1 private land in Sabine and Newton County in deep East Texas, right on the Louisiana border, and then a couple borders across the river in western Louisiana. The reason why this guy is in population decline is basically it requires some historical pine savannas. It likes that grassland pine savanna, and you really don't ever see it. It burrows underground and it eats gophers, pocket gophers. But that's the Louisiana pine snake. I think the last time they did a survey, they only recorded like 10 individuals in Texas. It's on a very steep decline. We go to bottom right. That's going to be our 3-toed box turtle. Nothing special about it from a protection standpoint, other than box turtles on a whole were kind of becoming a species of concern due to habitat loss and pet trade. But I just put that guy in there to kind of show the diversity of reptiles and amphibians we have in this part of the state. Probably some of our higher amphibian diversities found in the piney woods, mostly due to the large amount of waterways. And then the middle picture, it's hard to tell, but Texas, the piney woods in Texas is home to 3 native pine species: longleaf, loblolly, and shortleaf. And I took this picture because I actually found all 3 of those growing together in one site. But it's hard. Plant pictures are hard to put up on a screen, and I know it. So I do apologize for the plant pictures in the presentation because I know they're not the best. But you can see right in the middle is going to be a longleaf pine with pine needles about 8 to 10 inches. The one on the left is going to be your shortleaf pine, which has little bitty needles, and then there's a loblolly kind of stuck down in there underneath the the longleaf that you really can't find. But I just put that in there to show and talk about our 3 native pine species that we find in the piney woods. So longleaf, loblolly, and shortleaf. All right, so enough about the piney woods. So we are now going to move west into the post oak savanna. So that's going to be this kind of maroon color, brownish maroon color in here. I kind of joke, I don't know if the people that drew this map up did it intentionally, but it includes College Station and A&M. So I don't know if that's why they decided to make the post oak savanna maroon in this map, but they did. So it starts up again, kind of northeast Texas along the Red River in Lamar and Red River County. It continues down in a little strip west of Tyler, but east of Dallas. So Dallas is going to be in Dallas County, obviously. And then it kind of gets broader as it goes along. So it's kind of, if you go up I-45 between Houston and Dallas, you go through it between about Madisonville and Corsicana. You're in the post oak savanna. Then it goes down through College Station, east of I-35, east of Austin and San Antonio, and then kind of south and east of, or east of Austin and San Marcos, and then kind of south and east of San Antonio. It extends all the way down to Victoria and then just west of Houston. So, yeah, you get just west of Montgomery County, you kind of get in this transitional zone where we got a lot of ecoregions all coming together. I will note, if you see on the map, there's a little black sliver of another ecoregion. That's going to be the Blackland Prairie, which we talk about in our next presentation. But there is what we call the Southern Blackland Prairie, which kind of divides the post oak savanna there south of College Station. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So the post oaks extension is that far western extension of the deciduous woods that we find throughout the eastern United States. It's generally level to gentle rolling. It does have some hills here and there. This is really our last forested ecoregion. We get west of this, we start getting into grasslands and savannas, or more grasslands. So the post oak savanna has very sandy soils with a clay underpan. For any of y'all that know about growing crops, that is even worse than just having sandy and acidic soils. You have sandy soil that's going to dry out really quick, and then you have clay soils underneath that that's not going to allow the roots to penetrate it. So with all that being said, we never much farmed in this ecoregion. So a lot of the post oak savanna has never really been altered by humans that much. Now I say that it's been altered, but it wasn't, the timber wasn't harvested because the wood was too small and too corkscrewed to be merchantable like a pine tree. And then the soils weren't great except along the river bottoms to farm in. So we kind of just turned it into rangeland and pasture. So we've overgrazed it, took away fire, so it has been altered, but it still has a lot of the characteristics that we saw historically. And I would argue that the post oak savanna might be one of the more intact ecoregions left in Texas. So when I mean post oak savanna, it's named after post oaks and blackjack oaks, which were the historic, which is probably makes up about 80 to 90% of the woody tree vegetation in this ecoregion. Historically, it would have been a savanna, so we would have had little blue stem underneath it. And I got a picture of that on the next slide. But we have a lot of loss of savanna. And I know that this isn't a great picture, but the picture on the left is what I mean when we have a loss of savanna. So that's what a lot of the post oak savanna looks like now. We still have the post oak trees present, but the understory, we've overgrazed it. We took away fire. We don't do any kind of brush management. And we allow this yaupon just to underchoke and take it over. The picture on the right is Gus Engling WMA up in Anderson County, which the Parks and Wildlife manages specifically for post oak savanna restoration. So they run fires and do other management activities on the picture on the right. And this is what the post oak savanna should look like. The trees should just barely touch each other, and you should have some open spaces in between it, but you have a very diverse little blue stem prairie underneath the post oak trees. And y'all as master naturalists, I hope y'all come to recognize that the picture on the right has way more diversity and way more habitat for a lot of different animals than the picture on the left. The picture on the left is good for nothing but dense cover for deer to go into, escape cover when they feel threatened or want to have their fawns in the spring, or for hogs to go into. The picture on the right, they have quail out there at this place. They have turkeys, a bunch of grassland birds. They have a very healthy deer population, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to animals and plants in the post oak savanna, there's two of conservation importance to point out. The one on the left is going to be the Houston tow, which is an endangered species. Just loss of habitat. They live in these bogs that they need to spawn in. You can still find them around Bastrop, around College Station, down to around west of Houston, a little bit around Columbus. The picture in the middle is going to be the Navasotus lady's tresses. This is an endangered orchid that's again found in some of these bogs we find in the post oak savanna. And what I mean about bogs, post oak savanna has some unique geological characteristics where they have these bogs that really don't drain water. They stay wet, and the soil is so acidic that it really can't grow much of anything. And the Navasotus lady's tresses is one of those plants that can kind of survive in this very acidic, boggy habitat. Back to this picture here, where I said on the right was at the Gus Engling WMA. I probably should add that picture into the slide. They actually have some acidic bogs up there that actually have coniferous plants because the soil's too bad for nutrients. So the plants actually catch flies. They have sundews and stuff along them lines. The picture on the right is going to be a pine forest. And the reason why I put that in here was for the Lost Pines, which is around Bastrop, which is included kind of in this post oak savanna, depending on the source. Some of them included in the piney woods is just a distinct section, but it just depends. All right, so the next slide is going to be the Blackland Prairie.
Matt, before you go on, we did have a question online.
Yeah, y'all give me 1 minute, Michael. Somebody is banging the heck out of my door, so I'm going to have to get them to stop. But y'all get y'all's questions together.
All right.
Oh, shoot. No, I'm doing a presentation in here. No, you're good. All right, Michael, what you got?
Okay. The question is, how do we best control the growth of Yopon holly? For habitat restoration, how do we restore the understudy and get rid of the Yopon? Residential restorations using fire are not really.
So that is a very good question. It's one that we get asked a lot in Extension, especially working in this part of the state. So in a nutshell, fire is our cheapest and best option if it's practical for your property. I realize a lot of y'all that's probably not practical, or maybe it's something you're unhesitant to do. So with that, we then got to look into basically when we look at brush management, there's 4 areas. There's mechanical control, so that's physically going in there and altering it. Chemical control, which is going to be spraying a herbicide. Fire, or biological, which is going to be some kind of animal. So we talked about fire. Biological, there's really nothing we can do. I mean, some people try the goat thing, but goats ain't going to eat Yopon too much as it is. So there's really not a good biological option. So that leaves us physical, or mechanical and chemical. Mechanical, we can go in there with the mulcher, like on a skid steer, or if you have real small acreage, I mean, you can go in there with loppers and a chainsaw. You can remove that Yopon. So the bad thing about Yopon, it's going to resprout no matter how many times you go in there and cut it down. So you're going to have to go in there. If you're not going to burn it after you mechanically do it, the only option to control it is going to be a chemical option. And for small landowners and small acreage properties, that's going to be Remedy mixed with diesel. or just remedy in general. So we have different options. So one that remedies the herbicide. So option that a lot of landowners like to do, because it doesn't involve just spraying herbicide over their whole forest, is mixing 1 part remedy with 3 parts diesel. You then cut the Yopon stump down to the ground and you spray the stump. So you're mixing that remedy with diesel, and then you're cutting the tree down and you're spraying the herbicide directly on the stump. That can provide upwards to 95% mortality. So that's really the best option for y'all if you're looking at Yopon control on a really, really large scale. If y'all have more questions about that, y'all can get my email or ask y'all's local agent. They can help y'all with kind of developing a plan and giving y'all some more options. But again, remedy with diesel is kind of the best option for small scale Yopon control. Or if you don't want to cut the stump, you can just mix remedy with water and spray it on the whole Yopon. All right, any other questions? All right, so y'all got one or no?
No, none so far.
Okay, so Blackland Prairie. So that's going to be the ecoregion that's black in this slide. So it starts up north of Dallas, and then it kind of narrows as it goes down. And so it goes down through Hill County, which is Hillsborough, Navarro, which is Corsicana. So if you drive up I-45, you go through it. Then it goes down through Waco, Austin and Travis, down through east of San Marcos, New Braunfels, and right down through the middle of San Antonio. That's going to be what we call kind of the main Blackland Prairie, or the northern Blackland Prairie. And then again, like I mentioned earlier, if you look down south more towards Houston, there's actually another little strip that sometimes we call the Fayette or the San Antonio Prairie, or the southern Blackland Prairie, which basically goes through just west of Conroe. It really starts there in Montgomery, the town itself. It really starts there in Montgomery, the town itself, and then extends down along 105 through Navasota, Brenham, and then down through Schulenburg and Cuero. And it's a really little strip. But if you ever drive through there, a good example would be if you drive on 290 and 6 up from Houston to College Station. Around Hempstead, you're in the Post Oak Savannah. Then you get around Navasota, it opens up and it's more pasture. That you're in the Blackland Prairie, and then you get to College Station, you're back in the Post Oak. So one thing I want to point out, when we talk about the main Blackland Prairie area to the north, I said it ran through Dallas. It actually doesn't include Fort Worth and Tarrant County. That's in the next ecoregion. So if you're ever in the Metroplex, even though it all looks the same as one giant city, if you travel between Dallas and Fort Worth, you're actually going between 2 different ecoregions. But the Blackland goes through Dallas, Waco, San Marcos, New Braunfels, part of Austin and San Antonio. What does that connect? That's the I-35 corridor, right? The most populated area in Texas. So with that being said, the Blackland Prairie, do y'all really think there's a lot of it left? No, it's very altered. But historically, this was our true tall grass prairie in Texas. This was the prairie that the settlers first saw when they came out west. This is the same type of prairie system that you would have seen historically in places like Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, stuff like that. Very deep soil, so it made great farming. I'm going to talk about microtopography here in a minute, but farming was dominant. So first of all, we altered it and turned about 99% of it into farmland. And then after that, it became part of the I-35 corridor, and we had all these big cities pop up. The reason why we have a lot of cities in this ecoregion is because of farming. You know, in the 1800s, the farmers had to get their crops to the river very quick to get it transported down river, or they had to use the rivers to mill their crops or run the cotton gin. So that's why a lot of these cities in this part of the state popped up and became the major cities they are now. The big four. So when we look at the tall grass prairie, we look at the big four, which is going to be little blue stem, Indian grass, big blue stem, and switchgrass. So little blue stem, Indian grass, big blue stem, and switchgrass. That's our 4 major grasses that make up the tall grass prairie. So the picture on the left is going to be what the Blackland Prairie looks like, the soil. So obviously it hits the namesake Blackland Prairie, but you can see why this soil was so good for farming historically. Very deep, very thick, very good soils. The picture on the right is actually a remnant prairie in a preserve northeast of Dallas. So that's what the prairie historically looked like. So looking at that, y'all might think, well, it's all the same. It's just a sea of grasses. Well, actually, the Blackland Prairie has what we call microtopography, and we see this in a lot of prairies. There's actually little divots in there, or little high spots. It might only vary by 6 inches to a foot, but that actually causes more moisture or less moisture, and the soils to dry out quicker or less. So just for the sake of argument, here in the foreground of this picture of the prairie on the right might be a little bit lower than just 50 feet behind it, where it's kind of going up, kind of a little ridge right there. And so that you're going to have different plant species even across a prairie that just looks like a sea of grass, because you're going to have little changes in topography that we call microtopography. So here's a picture of the big four, which make up the tall grass prairie, not only here in Texas, but if you anywhere in the United States, when we talk about tall grass prairie, whether it be the Dakotas, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, wherever, Kansas, these are the four grasses that are going to make that up. It's going to be little blue stem, which is going to be on the top left, big blue stem with its turkey foot seed head on the bottom right, Indian grass in the middle, and then switchgrass on the right. So here, when we talk about showing y'all animals, it's kind of difficult to show y'all animals. So I had to show y'all, this is a artist's interpretation of the Blackland Prairie. So I just want y'all to look at this real quick. How many of y'all have ever drive down I-35 between Waco and Dallas, or Waco and Austin? Do y'all see anything that looks like this when you're driving down I-35 nowadays? No, right? So this ecoregion has been very altered. Unfortunately, like I said, there's really less than 1% of it left. Unfortunately, most of these animals have been extirpated, so they're extinct from this part of the state. I mean, such things would be bison, quail are pretty much gone from the Blackland Prairie. You got a wolf hunting there in the background. You have a prairie chicken. Some of the stuff you can still find, like some of the keen snakes and the garter snakes and the meadow larks and the scissor tails. But for the most part, most of these animals are no longer found in this part of the state. I will point out two things in this picture. One, you'll see woody vegetation was very limited, except in the background where you can see it's kind of in a little valley there. So kind of like along creeks down in the low spots would be the only spot we found woody vegetation. And you'll also see a fire burning in the background. So a lot, and this is just not true for the Blackland Prairie, but you'll hear me harp on it. It's just, again, fire and fire again and again. Most of Texas habitats were historically maintained by fire and were evolved and developed with fire. And our Native American Indians knew that, and they would set fire because it would attract game, because it would make the ecosystem happy and healthy. And with that being said, Texas gets enough rainfall in a lot of parts of the state that when we take away fire and we take away other brush management control, woody vegetation naturally is going to start to invade these ecoregions. All right. So we're now moving further west. We're getting west of the Blackland Prairie. We're into the cross timbers. The cross timbers is going to be this kind of yellow color on the map. The eastern edge of it includes Tarrant County, Fort Worth, Denton, up in Denton County up to the Red River. This extends well into the middle part of Oklahoma. The vast majority of the middle part of Oklahoma is in the cross timbers ecoregion. In Texas, it continues all the way south to the west part of Waco and Temple, and then just to the northwest of San Antonio. And then it tends west. Abilene would be in Callahan County there on the western edge, and then Wichita would be Wichita Falls up in the northwest edge. So it's kind of in that middle area between the Metroplex, the Panhandle, and then north of Austin in the Hill Country. We consider this kind of a transitional zone in the state. So it has a variety of soil types and geography, which tends to a lot of different habitats here and kind of a transitional zone, like I said. Shallow soil, so we didn't do a lot of farming. We have kind of a lot of limestone and gravel. I did say the post oak savanna was the last forest ecoregion. Yeah, it was the last true forest ecoregion, but when you look at kind of areas that still have forest, the cross timbers does have some forest in it. So this is like the last part of the state where you really will find some forest. Rainfall starts to become limiting. So before this point, rainfall is usually not a limiting factor on what vegetation we can grow. Once you get out to the cross timbers and further west, we actually it starts getting pretty arid and rainfall starts to become limited. Ranching was dominant, so this is another ecoregion that hadn't been altered a whole lot. I mean, it's been altered some, but ranching is pretty dominant. So we don't have any major cities in this ecoregion, so we don't have any urbanization issues. So historically, it would have been open prairies mixed with oak forest. And I'm going to show you all a picture of that here in a minute. And then there was some areas of juniper woodlands. If y'all ever been around Possum Kingdom Lake or around the Palo Pinto Mountains, which is just kind of a subset area around Possum Kingdom, that is where I'm talking about the juniper woodlands within the cross timber prairies. So the picture on the left is going to be a typical example of what the cross timber prairies looks like. And I'll ask y'all, if I was in person, I'd ask the group, but why do you think it was called cross timbers? Well, when the settlers first came across this part of the state, it was prairie crossed by oak timber. So they named it the cross timbers. And this picture on the left is a great example of that. You can see in the foreground, we have little blue stem. So we have a native prairie mixed with a cross timbers of oak trees in the background. And that would have been live oaks, but it includes a lot of very scrawny post oaks and black oaks and some other hickories. And then the picture on the right, that's actually going to be the Palo Pinto Mountains. And I included that in the slide to show that there is some significant topography in this ecoregion in certain areas. And you can see how thick the oak forest is here. So when I look at animals in the cross timbers, I hate to say an ecoregion is boring in Texas, but this might be one of our most, I guess, ununique ecoregions. It doesn't have any unique plants or animals that can't be found anywhere else. It doesn't have any really unique geography or topography or water features. So in this slide, I included just stereotypical Texas wildlife that you find out in this part of the state. So we have a lot of turkeys in this part of the state. We have a lot of white-tailed deer, and we get arid enough that we start getting jackrabbits and some of these other western species. I will point out on the turkey, I actually took the picture of the turkey myself while deer hunting. If y'all look at the face, I think the turkey actually had its eye pecked out or lost its eye at some point, because I almost think that the hen doesn't have an eye. So that's why I included it in here. Just kind of thought that was unique, but a side note. All right, so as we move further west, we're going to start getting up into that panhandle region, but not quite yet. So we move west out of the yellow region, which was the cross timbers, and we get into this kind of, I guess, salmon pink colored ecoregion. This is going to be what we call the rolling plains, and it goes by a whole lot of different names. But and this ecoregion is very diverse, and depending on your source, a lot of ecoregions, a lot of sources actually divide this up into two ecoregions. But for today's conversations and just keeping specifically with Gold's ecoregions, we're just going to call it the rolling plains. But what I want y'all to do is, if you see the panhandle of Texas, right, you see there in Childress County, which is right on the edge of the panhandle on the eastern side, just draw a line straight down and split that salmon color in half. Everything to the east of that line is a little bit different than everything west of that line. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to show y'all here in a minute. We're going to talk about the eastern rolling plains first, and then we're going to talk about the western rolling plains later. So to start off, we're going to talk about the eastern rolling plains, which again is going to be that line that starts kind of at the edge of the eastern edge of the panhandle and just splits that, goes straight down south and splits that pink color in half. This is what we call the southern extension of the low interior plains. So this would have been kind of where we start getting into that Great Plains ecoregion where, the settlers got in their wagons and hitched up in St. Louis and went west across the plains and encountered the bison and the Indians and the pronghorns. That was what we call the low interior plains. And this is the southern extension. And this interior plains, the rolling plains, extends up through Oklahoma, Kansas, and into Nebraska. Very level, kind of rolling, red clay and sand. If any of y'all ever been around the Brazos River down south of Houston or around College Station and all the soil's red and the water looks red, well, this is where it comes from. It all comes from the red clay and sand in the rolling plains. Farming and ranching is dominant. This is what we would have called a mid-grass prairie. So historically, the grasses would have got about knee to waist high. A lot of woody vegetation was only found in the riparian area, so along the major river bottoms. A lot of it has been transformed to shrubland through, again, lack of fire, overgrazing, lack of brush management. Unfortunately, and I'll show pictures here in a minute, a lot of this area has been lost, or a lot of the endemic prairie species have now been lost or altered. And a good example of that was I used to, in my previous extension agent job, not where I'm at now, but previously I had to do some work up in this part of the state. And I worked with the rancher that I was talking to him. He said, oh yeah, we used to have all these prairie dogs back in like the up to like the 90s. And now you don't see a prairie dog anywhere in this part of the state. And he's like, I don't know what happened to them. We used to have all these different prairie animals. And I said, I didn't want to tell him. I said, well, your place used to be a grassland. Now it's just a thick shrubland full of mesquite. And that's why you don't have all these prairie species anymore. So we have a lot of these endemic prairie species are now lost in the rolling plains. But it has become an epicenter for bobwhite quail in the state. It's actually one of our last strongholds for bobwhite quail. And the reasoning for this is we still have a lot of mixed grasslands along with some shrubs. With the shrubs and the mesquite basically provides cover for quail, so it made pretty good quail habitat. So I'll show some pictures of that. So the picture on the left was taken south of Wichita Falls, and that is stereotypical what this part of the state looks like. Now you might say, Matt, that looks like, a grassland. Why are you saying it's altered? Well, yeah, it's a grassland, but I personally took this picture and I know all that out there is either some kind of improved variety of non-native grass we planted, aka Bermuda, or some kind of altered native vegetation we planted in there that can handle the grazing pressure better. So yes, it's still a grassland, but no, it's not what it used to be. And I'll also point out on the picture on the left, you can see all, and when I mean woody vegetation encroachment, it's almost like 80% mesquite. All that, you can see all that in the background is all mesquite coming in on over that hill. So with mesquite just takes over this country. The picture on the top right is another good example. That was actually at Lake Arrowhead State Park, south of Wichita Falls. And you can see we do have some grassland, but look at how thick that mesquite is in the background. Historically, this would have been a part of the state where you might have seen one mesquite every 5 miles, except maybe along the river bottoms. The picture on the bottom right is going to be the Salt Fork of the Brazos River. So water starts to becoming pretty limited, and the Brazos River is obviously a major river here in the state. You can see how small it is in this part of the state. And its flow is very minimal. And that's actually why it's called the Salt Fork of the Brazos River, which is a tributary of the major Brazos River, because the water gets salty because the water doesn't flow that much and it gets stagnant and the water evaporates and it becomes salty. All right, so that was the eastern edge of the rolling plains. Now we're going to talk about the western edge of the rolling plains. So I'm going to go back up. That's going to be, again, the area west of that line that starts at the kind of in Childress County in the Panhandle and splits the pink in half and goes west. So the western part of this pink. This is the more interesting part of the rolling plains. Some sources will call this Southwest Tablelands or the Canyon Lands of the Southwest or the Break Country. This is probably one of the more interesting part of the states. So you can see the western part of it actually is made up of two areas. In the north, you can see how the pink color kind of splits the panhandle in the half. That's what we call the Canadian River or the Canadian Breaks. In the western part of it, starts just east of Amarillo, east of Lubbock, and goes down. That is a very defining feature in the state. I would ask if any of y'all know what that is. It is our deepest canyon. It is the second deepest canyon in the country behind the Grand Canyon. And it is home to something, Lighthouse Peak, which is a pretty recognizable peak. I'll mention it here in a minute. It is a Paladora Canyon, and it is part of the Cat Rock Escarpment, which is a major landscape feature in this part of the state. So I'm going to show some pictures there in a minute, but let's say you were in Lubbock here, just west of the rolling plains, and the next ecoregion that we call the high plains, that is very flat and level, and you can see forever. If you drove east of Lubbock, you would get to the Cat Rock Escarpment, and you would drop off into the rolling plains, and it literally is like the earth just falls out from underneath you. It is a very defining feature. A lot of these ecoregions, it's hard to define where one starts and another one ends because it kind of transitions between the two. You know, this topography slowly changes, the plants and animals slowly changes. Where the western rolling plain starts is very, very noticeable. So the western rolling plains along that Cat Rock Escarpment, or in the north, what we call the Canadian River Escarpment, is a very rugged landscape, variety of soils, very arid. I already talked about it being that longitudinal divide. It's rocky. There's no farming. We don't have a whole lot of grass, and what we do see is grama and buffalo grass. And I just included that in here if any of y'all are native landscapes or no native grasses. Kind of landscape is more of a juniper shrub oak kind of deal. And I mentioned it's known for the Cat Rock Escarpment, and then we have the Canadian River in the north. I'm going to talk about both of those here in a little bit. So to talk about the Cat Rock Escarpment, you have to include Paladora Canyon, which is the picture in the top left. As you can see, that is a very rugged, very canyon landscape. That is the second biggest canyon in the country, again behind the Grand Canyon in Arizona. So you can see, and that's Lighthouse Peak there in the middle. If you ever have a chance to go to Paladora Canyon State Park or traveling through Amarillo or up in the Panhandle, 10 out of 10 would highly recommend you visit. It's well worth it. So then the picture on the right is a little bit further south in Cat Rock Canyon State Park, which is east of Lubbock. And that is just a picture of the canyon lands there. And then the picture on the bottom left is actually Cat Rock Canyon State Park also. And I included that picture here on the bottom left because I was actually out there hunting for Aldad, which is a non-native sheep we brought over here, which is a story for another day. But it was, we wanted to hike, or I took that picture on the bottom left. We wanted to hike across kind of that flat area to them ridges in the background. And looking at that and looking at this picture, we thought, well, we can do that. There might be a few draws in here, but this landscape was so rugged. We attempted to walk across that flat spot and wait to turn around because we were going to die, because every 200 to 200 yards or so was just a 100-foot drop off in a little canyon. Then it would get flat again, and then it'd be another little canyon. So a very rugged landscape. So that's why I included that in here. So that's going to be our Cat Rock Escarpment, Paladora Canyon, western side of the rolling plains. Now on the north side of the rolling plains, I'm going to back up here, is going to be the Canadian River, or the Canadian Escarpment. And that includes that pink section that splits the panhandle up in half, so that the Canadian River flows through Oldham, Potter, Huskisson, Roberts, and Hemphill County. And that's where that little pink splits the panhandle in half. The Canadian breaks are very important for one reason, and that's because the Canadian River flows through there, and there's two very special animals. They call this place home that is important from a conservation standpoint. So we're going to talk about that in the next slide. But first off, I want to show y'all the Canadian River, which is in the middle part of this slide. And I know it's small, but you can see it's a very small, very shallow river, but it's kind of broad. And what I mean by that, it might only be 6 inches to a foot deep at best, but it's very broad. It's, you know, it might be several hundred yards across. And within that, you can see it's kind of hard to tell, but there's sandbars within this shallow river. And that's very important for one species, which I'm going to show. Actually, I'm going to skip around. So just keep the Canadian River in mind for now and its shallow sandbars. And I apologize, I know I'm skipping around here. So here's a slide of just some typical prairie species we find in the rolling plain. So we have burrowing owl on the top left. On the top right is side oats grama. That's our state grass of Texas. It's very common in this part of the state. Bottom right, like I said, we have a lot of bobwhite quail in this part of the state. Bottom left is where we start seeing prairie dogs in this part of the state. So just some cool, unique animals. And then in the middle is our state reptile, which is the Texas horned toad and or horned lizard. And that is, you know, we start seeing a lot of Texas horned lizards in this part of the state. So that's just some of the common wildlife we kind of see in parts of the rolling plains. Now, to go back where I was about the Canadian River, there's some unique species I want to talk about on this slide. And those two are the interior tern, which is on the top left, and the Arkansas silvery minnow, which is on the bottom right. And both of those rely heavily on the Canadian River and the rolling plains. And to back up to the conversation I was having earlier about the Canadian River being very shallow with these sandbars, do y'all see where that intern tern, that bird on the top left, what is it sitting on? It's sitting on sand, right? It's actually sitting on a sandbar in the Canadian River. And believe it or not, that tern is actually on its nest. That is all it does to protect its eggs and its babies. It literally digs out a little hole in the sandbar and lays its eggs. It doesn't do anything else to protect its babies or its eggs. So you ask, well, that seems like a pretty stupid survival strategy. Well, it is if that sandbar is connected to the mainland, because now you have raccoons and coyotes and foxes, bobcats, and all kind of other predators that can easily, obviously, walk out there and just raid that nest. But what these terns have evolved to is these rivers that we see in the plain states, so Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, all tend to be very broad with these sandbars in the middle. Well, if there's water, even if it's only a foot deep, like we find in the Canadian River, if that water separates that sandbar from the mainland or the bank, it protects that tern's nest from predators. So that's good then. Well, what has happened is, just in the case with the Canadian River in Texas, we've dammed it up. So if you create a dam with the lake, you obviously take away the sandbars. Or we've drained a lot of water out of it for irrigation purposes or municipality purposes for drinking, because remember, this is a pretty arid part of the state. So now we've taken away all these sandbars, and this tern no longer can lay its eggs on a protected sandbar in the river. And the tern is now a protected species. I think it's classified as threatened. I don't think it's quite made it up to endangered yet. But where I'm going with all this is the vast majority of the rivers that terns used to be able to nest on and have protection from predators, it no longer exists because we've altered that habitat, the flow of water in the river. The Canadian River and the Texas Panhandle and the Rolling Plains is one of the few rivers that still has stretches that provide suitable nesting habitat. So the Canadian River in Texas is very important for the continuation of this interior tern. All right, so that's all I have on the tern. On the bottom right is the Arkansas silvery minnow. Now you might say, well, this is just some little minnow that, why should we care about it? Well, you should care about it because it's an endangered species, because it was endemic to the Arkansas River, which the Canadian River flows into. So it was endemic to the Canadian River. this Arkansas silvery minnow has been lost from almost all the Arkansas rivershed because we have altered water flows. So what the minnow does is it's what we call it lays its eggs, but if that egg falls out of the water column and lands on the bottom of the river bottom or the soil on the bottom of the river, the egg dies. It has to be suspended for like a day or two in the water column. So to achieve that, you have to have enough water flow. Well, through dams and reservoir construction, and then us taking water out of the river for irrigation municipality purposes, we have decreased the water flow in so much of the Arkansas rivershed that we have pretty much caused this minnow to go extinct because its eggs are falling out before they have a time to hatch. Because they can travel upwards of like a couple 100 miles in that 24 to 2 day period when they need to stay suspended in the water column. Good thing about Texas is the Canadian River in Texas has some of the only last remainable habitat that has enough water, stream flow to sustain the Arkansas silvery minnow. So with all that being said, is you might think this little river that just looks like a little drop of water up in the panhandle isn't very important for conservation. Well, it is for these two species. All right, so enough on the Canadian River. And I spend a lot of time on these ecoregions out west because I think they just have cooler stuff, or maybe it's just because we're in the eastern part of the state, so we see the same stuff, and this is different than we have. But as you can see in the middle is a bison. Now, we have bison in North America. Buffalo are from Africa and Asia. So just a side note. So this is bison. We all know the story of the bison, how we pretty much extirpated them, caused them to go extinct. Parks and Wildlife about 10 or so years ago actually released some semi-wild bison into Caprock Canyon State Park where they're free roaming. So it's almost kind of like our Benny Yellowstone now. So if you want to go see some wild bison in somewhat of a true natural setting in Texas, you can do that. The picture on the top right is mule deer. Now, mule deer are unique because you find them in the western third of Texas. You know, we obviously have whitetails out where we are. If y'all were in person, I would ask y'all, do you know why it's called mule deer? Most of y'all would guess, well, it's got big ears, right? Well, the settlers saw these mule deer when they came out west. The big ears reminded them of their mules. Now, where I would ask y'all as a group is, and make you think a little bit, is biologically, why do these mule deers have big ears? Well, you think about it, they're in arid landscapes, it's dry, it's hot. They use this to survive out there. They have a lot of blood vessels in them big ears that come in contact with the atmosphere, the air, and it helps them cool. It's just like an elephant that has big ears to help it cool down also. So that's why mule deers have big ears. It's not because it makes them look cool and it makes them look like a mule. It's because biologically it allows them to stay cooler in this hotter climate. And one more note on mule deer, just to stay on time. 30 minutes left, basically. Mule deer are actually kind of in a decline in some parts of the state because whitetail deer are actually overtaking them. And we believe the reasoning for this is mule deer are more adapted to open areas, so more grasslands and prairies, compared to whitetail deer that are more adapted to brushland, which is one reason why we have millions and millions and millions of whitetail in Texas, is we got a lot of brush. But we have, as brushland has started to encroach on some of this mule deer parts of the state, the whitetail deer are able to outcompete the mule deer and are able to push them out. So, and you might think, well, that's good. I mean, we know whitetail deer are a very valuable resource in the state. There's a lot of ranchers and landowners that make a living off of whitetail hunting, which is true. But actually up in the panhandle in West Texas, mule deer are actually more valuable than whitetail because people don't go out there to pay to hunt whitetail. They pay to hunt mule deer. So there's actually parts of the state where we were actually trying to get rid of the whitetail deer instead of actually encourage the population growth, which is totally different than for the vast majority of the state. All right, so enough of the rolling plains, which might be one of the more cooler ecoregions other than the mountains out west. So now we get into the high plains, which is going to be this kind of brown color on the western part of the panhandle. And that includes Lubbock and Amarillo for the most part. So the high plains is a very short grass prairie. So again, you're only looking at 6 to 8 inches of growth. If you ever heard of, in Texas, sometimes we call it the Llano Estacado, which the Spanish explorers called it that, and it translates to stack plain, which is a very, very appropriate name for this ecoregion because it's very arid and it's very level and it's very flat. The reason why it's actually flat is because it's all the silt that eroded off the Rocky Mountains and over the millennium, and it's settled out flat east of the Rocky Mountains. We do see a lot of soil erosion, especially when we have farming and remove the vegetation. This is where we had the Dust Bowl back in the 30s. Farmland is very dominant. Even though it's very arid and dry, the soil is absolutely excellent for farming. And Lubbock is actually surrounded by the largest cotton field in the world. Oil and gas is dominant. We have the Okalaga Aquifer, which is very important from an irrigation standpoint because if you live in West Texas or the Panhandle of Texas, Eastern New Mexico, Western Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, parts of Colorado and Wyoming, all your water comes out of the Okalaga Aquifer. It is the only reason why humans even really exist in this part of the country. Playa lakes are important. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we do see some remnant prairie tracts where we still see some of those Great Plains species, prairie chickens, bison, pronghorn, stuff like that we saw historically. So here's some pictures of the high plains. So top left is a typical example of the high plains, very flat, a lot of farmland. But we do still see some prairie like you see in the bottom left. This is actually taken at a National Wildlife Refuge, but you do still see some prairie also on the top right in what we call these sand hills that we find out here. The sand hills are very limited, but they're important from a conservation standpoint because what can you do in a sand hill? You can't farm it, right? I mean, it's sand and it's not level. So the sand hills in this part of the state actually is where we still see a lot of our native landscape and animals. Unfortunately, that's also where we see a lot of oil and gas production, especially around like the Permian Basin. And that has a whole nother conservation aspect to it. But that's a conversation for another day. But you can see this is what the high plains looks like now on the top left and what it looked like historically on the bottom left. I put the picture on the bottom right of the biggest snowstorm ever recorded in Texas. And I don't quote me because I don't remember the amount, but I think this was from the 20s. And you can see the wind drifts on the side of the house almost go up to the edge of the roof. So, I mean, this is where we get into the part of the state where you can have very big weather extremes and you can get temperatures and weather that come straight down from Canada and the Arctic. And we also have dust bowls. So, if you live up in Lubbock and Amarillo, you got to be prepared for 120-degree weather with blowing dust and zero visibility, or -10-degree weather with blowing snow and zero visibility. So you get both ends of the spectrum there. I do want to talk about on the top left picture, go back to that. You see all the water features in there, right? So we call those playa lakes. Those are very important in this part of the state and for conservation in Texas because they winter a vast majority of the waterfowl and shorebirds that migrate down from the central part of Canada and the Dakotas during the wintertime. So the playa lakes are natural lakes that typically don't hold water, but when it does rain in this part of the state, they do hold water and they're internally drained. They're basically little shallow depressions in this flat grassland. They don't drain anywhere. And you can see the farmers actually typically don't farm them because when it rains, your crop's gonna flood. Now, historically, a lot of these playa lakes were actually farmed because farmers were trying to get every stinking acre of crop they could get planted. Nowadays, farmers recognize the conservation value of them, and also through government programs through the FSA and the USDA, they get paid not to farm these farmlands on a per acre basis. So the farmer gets the benefit of it. His farmer gets the benefit of his land producing, but he's not having to farm it. So it's a win-win both for conservation and the public and the government, and it's a win for the farmer. But the playa lakes are very important again because they winter these waterfowl. And a great example of this would be the top left. Here is a playa lake that is just absolutely loaded with sandhill cranes. They also hold geese and ducks and sandpipers and shorebirds and a whole plethora of birds. If you are either a avid birder or a big time bird hunter, you flock to this part of Texas and the country to hunt playa lakes. Bottom left is going to be a prairie chicken. We still do have some wild populations of lesser prairie chicken in some remnant areas in the high plains. Unfortunately, their population continues to decrease. They are on the state protected list. They are not on the federal protected list yet, and that has a lot more to probably do with politics and the effects that will have on oil and gas production instead of actual from a conservation and biological standpoint. But we still do have some prairie chickens. Parks and Wildlife has been proactive. They took them off. They removed them from as a game species at this point, probably about 15, 20 years ago, and is working with landowners up there to try to protect them, to prevent them from actually becoming a federally protected species so that it doesn't have impacts to oil and gas production. So we are, as a state, we are trying to be proactive. So is some landowners. Yeah, we see some bison. The bottom right picture I included was pronghorn antelope because for two reasons. One, that's one of my favorite animals in the state. I just think they look absolutely awesome and just a cool animal. And two, from a how do we manage animals in Texas with the growing population and managing everybody's needs. So pronghorn antelope are a great conservation story. Our population in the Panhandle is doing very well. The population out in West Texas, like around the Davis Mountains and El Paso, not so much, but the ones up in the Panhandle, the population has actually increased over the last couple of decades. And that is because landowners, farmers and ranchers and conservations and state agencies have all worked together to improve the habitat for antelope. So one thing they do is, and I included this picture because you can see we have them in grassland, but look right behind them is an irrigated pivot of probably cotton or corn. So, I mean, we can coexist with animals. We just got to learn how to manage for them. And so what we've done as from a conservation standpoint is we realized that antelope don't jump fences. Believe it or not, you would think the antelope or the fast pronghorn are the fastest land animal in North America. You would think they could jump a barbed wire fence. No, they evolved in an area of the country that was just flat grassland. They had no reason to jump to escape predators historically. They just outran mountain lions and whatever else, they evolved with. So they see a barbed wire fence, they just turn, they don't jump over it. Well, what happens is we've fenced off all these, barbed wire fences have just increased over the years. We've basically fenced off antelope from habitat that they could be using because they won't jump the fence to get to it. So what we've gone in, again, through conservation payments to landowners and just landowners being proactive, is if you raise that bottom barbed wire of the fence maybe up to knee height, your cows won't be able to get out, but the antelope will slip underneath it. So basically, throughout this part of the state, the Panhandle, where we have pronghorns, we've created pronghorn crossings where we've basically raised fences up a little bit so they can cross underneath it. It's amazing that antelope can't jump the fence. I mean, they'll jump a little bit, but if they come across, 5-foot tall fence, they're gonna go to the left or the right. And what these animals do when they get up in the morning, they literally pick one direction and they will just walk or run that direction all day long, and they might go 10, 15 miles. So if there's a barbed wire fence that they can't cross under, well, then they're keeping them from getting to where they want to go. All right, so we got 4 more ecoregions to roll through, and they're kind of my favorite, and I always leave them for the last, and I always think that kind of does them injustice. But next, we're going to move into the Trans-Pecos. This is going to be our probably most diverse ecoregion, both from a geological standpoint, topography, plants and animals, just really from everything. And so the Trans-Pecos contains, and back to here because I kind of threw through. The Trans-Pecos is basically definitely everything west of the Pecos River. It transitions out there, so it's not a hard line when you leave the high plains or the Edwards Plateau, which we're going to talk about next, and transition into the Trans-Pecos or the desert. But generally, once you get west of the Pecos River, we consider you in the Trans-Pecos. In Texas, we like to call this the Big Bend region, but it contains one of the four deserts in North America. So our desert in Texas is the Chihuahua Desert. And I just want to point out real quick, there's four deserts in North America. There's the Chihuahua, the Mojave, the Soro, and the Great Basin. All four are known by one thing. So the Great Basin is like where Death Valley is. So it's known for like nothing, right? The hottest place on the earth. Kind of cool, right? And that's then the Mojave Desert is known for, drawing a blank here. The Mojave Desert is where the Death Valley is. So Mojave Desert's known for the Death Valley. The Great Basin is like around Salt Lake, so it's known for Salt Lake and the salt brush out there. And then the Saguaro Desert is in Arizona. It's known for the saguaro cactus that everybody thinks we grow here in Texas. And then we have the Chihuahua Desert here in Texas. And it's recognized by creosote bush, which is one of the nastiest plants you can ever think of. So even though we have desert in Texas, which is very unique, we don't have a cool plant or a cool landscape like these other four deserts do in North America. We have some internally drained areas, so we have some salt. We do have a few smaller salt lakes, mostly rangeland. There is some very good farmland, but it's along the Rio Grande and it's irrigated. What's neat about the Trans-Pecos is we have a lot of western species that you find in New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado that reach their eastern limit in this part of the state. Or we have a lot of Mexico species that you only find in the mountains of northern Mexico and then in a few areas in West Texas. So you have a lot of species that you find no otherwhere else in the country. We have what we call sky islands. So basically, once you get high enough in elevation, your plants and your climate starts to change. And we call those sky islands because the tops of the mountains are different than the surrounding desert floor. We have desert springs that have a lot of unique fish and just a variety of vegetation. So on this slide, I'm going to run through what the vegetation changes as you go up in elevation in the Trans-Pecos. So we're going to start in the top left. That is on the desert floor. You have your basically what would have been a grassland, creosote grassland. Remember, I said the Chihuahua Desert in Texas is known for its creosote bush. That picture on the top left is just chock full of creosote bush. And what I mean creosote bush probably does provide some kind of food source or nesting material for something. But on a whole, nothing grazes creosote bush. Cows don't graze it for sure. Most animals don't graze it unless they're starving, like deer and antelope. And it's called creosote bush because it secretes a chemical, creosote, that literally doesn't allow other plants to grow around it. So once you get your desert gets choked full of creosote bush, nothing else can grow because there's toxins in the ground that plant emits to prevent other grasses from coming up. Historically, we would have had more grasses out here, but it didn't take us long to overgraze it. A good example is there's actually some old extension publications back when we didn't know any better that suggested you could put one cow to every 4 to 5 acres in this part of the state. That is a stocking rate we see around Houston where we get 60 inches of rain, not out here in West Texas where we get 8. Nowadays, a conservative stocking rate in this part of the state is one cow to maybe every 150 to 250 acres. So you can see when we grazed it like we grazed it out east, we quickly overgrazed it, took away the grasses, and we let the creosote bush overgrow. So you have creosote grasslands at the bottom desert floor. You go the picture on the top right, when you start, you might start out around 4,000 to 6,000 feet. You go up around 6,000 feet, so you go up a couple thousand feet in elevation. You get these high desert grasslands that you see around Marfa and Alpine, where we have grasslands, and that's a good example of a high desert grassland on the top right picture. Now, if you go up a little bit higher, like you would in the middle picture on the bottom, this is in the Davis Mountains, you get montane woodlands like I mentioned earlier. So you get evergreen woodlands or evergreen pine forests like you might see in New Mexico or Colorado or Arizona up in the mountains. So that's a picture of Davis Mountains on the bottom middle, and that's actually Mount Livermore. That's actually a picture of Mount Livermore, which is the second highest peak in Texas. I think it tops out over 8,000 feet, 8,600 feet, something like that. So obviously we have a wide range of elevation, almost 4,000 to 5,000 feet difference in elevation between the desert floor and the tops of our highest mountain peaks out in the Trans-Pecos, which is going to lead to a lot of different vegetation and animals. So geologically, I want to talk about two things. Picture on the bottom left is an aerial picture of the Big Bend National Park, or part of it. If y'all are geologists, you would quickly recognize what caused that. That is not limestone. That is not caused by plate shifting. That is actually called, we have a lot of ancient dormant volcanoes out in this part of the state. And that is actually lava flows that actually dried to create the mountains out in that part of the Big Bend National Park. So you can kind of see how the mountains almost kind of look flowing. Well, that's ancient lava flows. This is the only part of the state that you're going to find lava rocks like that. And then the picture on the bottom right, that is out in Guadalupe Mountains National Park out in next to Del City, where we actually have a very large internally drained area that creates salt. So we have salt lakes just like you would around Salt Lake City, except ours typically doesn't hold water except when we get very large rainfalls. All right, so here's some pictures of some of the trees you might find in up in the mountains out in the Trans-Pecos. So on the left, we'll go left to right. On the left is a picture of a ponderosa pine, which you can see very tall pine tree, just like we would have out here in Conroe. The picture in the middle is alligator juniper. Y'all can probably guess why it's called alligator juniper. If you look at its bark, its bark looks like the back of an alligator. And then picture on the right is Texas madrone, which is personally, I think one of the coolest trees. You can actually find that in the central part of the state too, but they tend to get the prettiest and tallest and biggest out here in the Trans-Pecos. And you can see they kind of slough off their bark and reveal their kind of white and pink lumber or bark. So here's just kind of the variety of animals you can find out in the Trans-Pecos. We have pronghorn antelope. We'll start in the top left and go clockwise. We have pronghorn antelope. We have canyon towhees, which are a species that are very common out in the western United States, but they reach their eastern limit out in the Trans-Pecos. We have a whole variety of darters and pupfish that are only found in these desert springs. So we have a lot of endangered fish out in this part of the state, believe it or not. But that is literally because there is one desert spring that they are found in, and that desert spring might be the size of the size of the house y'all are sitting in right now. So some, Yahoo went and dumped a tank of oil in there or some kind of chemical, they would literally kill the species. So that's why they're protected. It's not necessarily because their population is declining. It's literally because we have a bunch of fish that are found in literally one small spring out in the mountains somewhere. Picture on the bottom right is a mountain jay, which I just included that because I was feeding crackers to it on the side of the picnic side of the road out in the Davis Mountains. You can see it's eating my cracker. Bottom right is black bears. Now, black bears are interesting because black bears are making a comeback across the state, not only in East Texas where we have Louisiana black bears coming in from Louisiana and Arkansas, but out in the western part of the state where we now have breeding, we pretty much have breeding black bear populations throughout the Trans-Pecos, and now probably even down into South Texas and into parts of Central Texas, even getting close to probably San Antonio and Austin. This all started out in Big Bend in the Trans-Pecos, though. So what happened was we killed all our black bears out. Thought they were predators, overhunted them, fur, whatnot, in the 1800s, early 1900s. Black bears actually reestablished themselves in the Big Bend area of the Trans-Pecos from mountains about 100 miles to the south in Mexico in the 80s. This is the only example in modern times of a large predator repopulating a range it was currently extinct from. So you think of wolves, bears, any other large predatory mammal that you might find, maybe like we'll go back with wolves as an example in Wyoming. Wolves did not naturally repopulate Wyoming and Montana. We brought them there. They probably would not have done that because they would have had to transition hundreds, if not thousands of miles. Black bears out in West Texas is the only example of a large predatory species recolonizing an area it was previously extinct from. So these black bears, like I said, they literally transitioned a couple hundred miles of open desert, which isn't the best habitat for them, to go from mountains in Mexico to mountains out in West Texas. Now you go out to Big Bend and the Davis Mountains, they're not common, but I mean, we're running into issues where they are raiding trash cans and are becoming nuisance, and we have to relocate them back out to wilderness. I even saw a report where they took one that was raiding a restaurant's trash can out in Big Bend National Park routinely. They trapped it, moved it about 100 miles all the way to the other end of the national park, and within like 2 weeks, it was back at that dumpster again. I mean, these animals know where to find food, but but they have now. I mean, it's going to turn into a great conservation success story for Texas. Is they've now, their populations have now gotten high enough that these males and young females are now moving east. If you do internet searches, bears are starting to turn up routinely in places like Bandera and Uvalde and central parts of the state, down in South Texas around Laredo and Del Rio. And you talk to some of the Extension came out with a handout last year, pretty much how do we deal with a growing black bear population in more urban areas. So it is likely in 30 to 40 to 50 years, we are going to have a stable black bear population in a large part of the state that they went extinct from 100 years ago. So pretty good conservation success story. And that also has to do with that we now realize these little black bears aren't hurting our cows and stuff also. So there's some education there. So picture on the left is bighorn sheep. We've also brought bighorn sheep back out to West Texas. We killed them off both through diseases from domestic sheep and from overhunting, but we brought these back in the mid to late 1900s, and they're now established on several mountain ranges. All right, so, and Michael, I know I'm getting short on time, so if I go over too much, just stop me, and y'all can just stop me. So I'll keep going. But we got 3 more ecoregions to get through. So one more on Trans-Pecos. These are all pictures from the Guadalupe Mountain National Park. So if you actually take the Guadalupe Mountains in West Texas, which is just one area, it's about 100 square miles. Some geologists actually associate that with the Rocky Mountains, because I'm not a geologist, so don't question me on this. But the features that create the geological time frame that created the Guadalupe Mountains is the same geological factors that created the Rocky Mountains. So some people actually group the Guadalupe Mountains as the far, far southern extent of the Rocky Mountains. Compared to the Davis Mountains, the Chias Mountains, the other mountains we have out in West Texas, we associate those more with the Chihuahua Desert and volcanic activity. So these are all pictures of the Guadalupe Mountains. Bottom left, it's the only part of the state we actually find a chipmunk in. That's our only native chipmunk species in Texas, is found in the Guadalupe Mountains. Our only native trout, which is no longer present in the Guadalupe Mountains, which was Rio Grande cutthroat trout, was found in the Guadalupe Mountains. The picture in the middle is a Douglas fir. So believe it or not, that is actually the same Douglas fir that if a couple months ago you went and brought a Douglas fir from the garden center to put it in your house for Christmas, this is a wild Douglas fir growing in the mountains of West Texas. And then we have elk in the Guadalupe Mountains. And the picture on the bottom right is actually McKidrick Canyon. So if you ever get a chance to go out there in the fall, it's really beautiful. All right, so on to our next region, which is probably the most popular one for tourism in the state. It's going to be the Edwards Plateau. So this is that hill country in the middle part of the state, or what we call it like the hill country. It's a limestone plateau, very shallow soils. So since it's limestone, it's been eroded over the millennium, and that's why we now have hills and canyons. Excuse me. A lot of ranching, a lot of urbanization issues coming in from Austin and San Antonio on the eastern edge. Historically, it would have been a more open savanna. Now it's more thick woodlands of juniper and cedar and oak. If you actually read some of the original settlers' accounts, or even not even that, even some of the people that settled, the Germans and the Austrians that settled in this part of the state in the early 1900s and late 1800s, the reason why they settled in Fredericksburg and areas like that is it reminded them of the Alps where they came from, of the Austrian Alps and the German Alps where they came from, where it was these rolling grassland hills that were just ideal for grazing sheep and pasture and farming. Well, y'all that have been west of Austin and San Antonio, it's just chock full of cedar now. A lot of Texas endemics, so we find a lot of species in this part of the state that are only found in the springs and rivers in the hills that we find in this part of the state. So here's some typical pictures of the Edwards Plateau. Top left would be what it looks like now in the lot, rolling hills full of oaks and junipers. This is what we call karst geography in this part of the state. So karst geography is where we have limestone that allows water to infiltrate, and then we have tunnels and sinkholes, and it comes back up in these springs and rivers. So that's why we have all these clear flowing streams in the hill country, because we have limestone that flows into the Edwards Aquifer, and then it comes back out in the spring in the Guadalupe River, the Nueces, the Medina, stuff like that. So that's what you see on the right. Bottom left is actually a Chanet Rock, and it's actually a Chanet Rock is actually what is a little subset of the Edwards Plateau. It's actually really a different ecoregion, but for plants and animals, we keep it all the same. But from geologically, a Chanet Rock is actually what we call the Llano Uplift, which is basically just a one county area in the middle part of the state, which is actually granite, not limestone. So if you want to go see the oldest rocks in Texas, go to a Chanet Rock or the Llano Uplift around Llano and look at these granite rocks, because that is way older than the surrounding limestone. So here are some Texas endemics that you can find nowhere else in the lower 48 outside of Texas. So that includes Guadalupe bass on the right. Our state fish is only found in the Edwards Plateau. Golden cheek wobbler, which is a protected species, which nest in the Edwards Plateau in the summertime in the cedar trees, and then it winters in Central America. We got some unique species such as this fishhook cactus on the bottom. And then our most unique species are all going to be these species that we find in these springs and cave systems. So these are all protected species that are typically found in only one cave system in the Texas Hill Country. So we have little arthropods like spiders and beetles and stuff like that. We have Texas wild rice, which is only found in the Comal River, which is on the bottom right in San Marcos. And then we have a bunch of little darters and pupfish. But some of the weirdest species are going to be, we have about 4 or 5 blind salamanders that they live down in the aquifer. And really the only time that we see them is when we have a flood and it pushes them up through these springs. These blind salamanders have external gills. They have no eyes, or really rudimentary eyes, because they don't need to see. They're in pitch darkness, and they're translucent. There's actually one species called the Texas, or the Blanco blind salamander, that is only known from one species are from one specimen that came up in a flood in the Blanco River like 40, 50 years ago. So we really don't know if that species is extinct, just down so far deep in the aquifer that we never see it. We really don't know. All right, so 2 more ecoregions, if y'all bear with me. This is going to be our far southern one. This is going to be our southern Texas plain. You also hear it called the brush country of South Texas, or scrubland, or scrub country. This is pretty much everything south of San Antonio and Del Rio, down to the Rio Grande River, extends down into Mexico. Technically, it does not include the little strip that you find along the Gulf of Mexico. That's actually going to be part of the coastal plain. So, but down in South Texas, it pretty much extends down to the Gulf of Mexico. The lower Rio Grande Valley is going to be in here, and that has a whole unique set of animals that you find nowhere else in the country or the state. So kind of rolling to moderate, a lot of different soils, very arid, but when you get down in that deep valley area around Brownsville and Harlingen, it's very subhumid, subtropical, warm winters, mostly ranching, a lot of oil and gas production. Historically, it would have been more grassland. I mean, the Keene Ranch actually shot a pronghorn antelope in the 1930s in Keensville. Maybe I've ever been down around Keensville now. It's just straight up mesquite and scrub country like we see on this slide here. Up into the 20s and 30s of the 1900s, this was still enough grassland down here to support pronghorn antelope, believe it or not. But here's stereotypical South Texas scrub country. And you can see what it looks like here. Variety of thorny stuff. They typically say everything down here either is going to scratch you, bite you, or cut you. I mean, it's tough country. On the picture on the right, you literally could not walk through that even if you wanted to. I mean, it is just full of cactus and acacia and catclaw and mesquite and everything else. But this scrub country holds some of the most diverse animals and plants that you will not find anywhere else in Texas, but nowhere else in the country, because they reach their far northern extent in South Texas. This includes such things as the indigo snake on the top left, the groove-billed Annie on the bottom left, the Texas tortoise in the middle, and the green jay on the bottom right. So if any of y'all are birders, you know that the South Texas Plains or the lower Rio Grande Valley is a absolute birding mecca, not only for Texas and the US, but the world. You can literally pay thousands of dollars to get tours of the Rio Grande Valley, by these international birding companies. Do want to point out, if y'all notice what the Texas indigo snake is eating on the top left, its favorite food is snakes, and especially poisonous snakes. It loves to eat western diamondback rattlesnakes, and these Texas indigo snakes can get huge. They can get upwards of 10 to 15 feet and be very thick. All right, so our last ecoregion is going to be the Gulf Prairies or the coastal plains. It extends from Beaumont, and it actually starts in Louisiana, but it extends through Beaumont, through Houston. It reaches its widest distance actually here in Waller County, where we're about 120 miles from the coast, and then narrows as it goes down along the coast through Corpus and down to Brownsville. It's a very flat, narrow strip. Historically, it would have been more of a midgrass as you got further west, like around Waller, but around the deeper soils right around the Gulf, it would have been a tall grass prairie. This is probably our most altered ecosystem, along with the Blackland Prairie that we mentioned earlier. The reasoning being why: good soils, a lot of farmland, a lot of urbanization, petrochemicals huge in this part of the state. So very altered. This is our youngest ecoregion from a geological standpoint. Just some other things to note: freshwater inflows are very important. So these rivers feed these bays. Without us fresh water coming in from these rivers to these bays, all our important marine life that we eat, such as shrimps and crabs and redfish and flounder, would all suffer because they need fresh water to spawn. But incredible diversity. The Laguna Madre is actually the most hypersaline ecosystem one of the most is the largest hypersaline ecosystem in the world. So the Laguna Madre is the internal bay between Corpus Christi and Brownsville on the inward side of Padre Island. That area of our coast is actually more saltier than the ocean. The water does not actually flow out of it. The tides don't come in and flow out of it. But it supports an incredible amount of marine life and marine vegetation. So here's just some pictures of what our coastal prairies look like. Top left is a cordgrass, or a Spartina marsh or a cordgrass marsh. The marine biologists actually say our cordgrass marshes, like you might find when you drive down to Galveston when you're in the back bays, actually hold more biodiversity than any marine ecosystem other than tropical coral reefs. The Laguna Madre in the middle is home to eelgrass, which is home to redhead ducks, which 95% of the population winters on the Laguna Madre. We have sand dunes. Bottom left is going to be pictures of the tallgrass prairie once you get in a little bit. Bottom middle is what we call the saltgrass prairie. So these are those areas that the soil is salty, but it does flood during a hurricane or a really high tide event. And then another subset of the prairie is going to be the picture on the bottom right, which is what we call these Columbia bottomlands. If y'all ever been down to Freeport or Lake Jackson or that area down south of Houston around Missouri and Matagorda County, it's oak woodlands. It's these 1,000-year-old oak trees that just form these thick palmetto and oak woodlands. And it is actually the Columbia bottomlands down along the Brazos River bottom and the Columbus, Colorado River bottom is actually the only place on the western Gulf Coast of Mexico, so from Florida on down through Mexico, where woodlands actually touch directly the Gulf of Mexico. And you ask, well, why is this important that these woods actually border directly the Gulf of Mexico? Well, all these little neotropical migrants, like this orchard oriole on the bottom right, that spend the summer on the eastern seaboard, like up in the Northeast in New York, they migrate downwards and then go across the Gulf of Mexico. Well, they fly directly across the Gulf of Mexico, and the first place they land is our woodlands in Texas on the Columbia bottomlands. So these bottomland forests in Texas that are right next to the Gulf of Mexico are essential to carry on the migration for these little songbirds, because they need to use those woodlands to refuel after they migrate across the ocean. So just a variety of wildlife here. Top left is one of the more interesting ones that I didn't learn about until I actually worked in Palacios on the coast. That is a land crab. We actually have land crabs in Texas that do not need water and can live upwards from 5 miles inland from the Gulf. The only time they are actually found in marine water is when they're laying their eggs and reproducing. We do have prairie chickens still at the Atwater Prairie Chicken Wildlife Refuge. Texas has records of all 5 sea turtle species in the world, but the Kemp Rileys and the Kemp Rileys, which is pictured here, we have a lot of nesting sites in Texas, highly endangered species. And then a lot of, for birders, skimmers, ducks, songbirds, we have all kind of, one of our highest birding diversity in this part of the state. And then obviously you can't mention the Gulf without mentioning our marine life and our marine fishes. We have a very healthy and diverse marine fisheries ecosystem here in Texas. So flounder on the top left, redfish on the top right, commercially important species. Bottom left is a blenny, I believe, and then you can just see in the middle pictures just some more variety: sheep's head, whiting, black drum. And then the bottom right is probably one of the most ugliest fishes you can catch. That is actually a toadfish. And what these little things do is they have a huge mouth that's full of really big molar-like teeth. And they bite into oysters and clams whole. And so if you were to stick your finger in his mouth, it would not be a pretty day, because he can literally bite through an oyster shell. All right, so that rolls through our ecoregions. And I had some more slides because I wanted to, we'll skip through this. but I did provide y'all's Michael and them a copy of all this if they want to try to get it to you. But I included, and I'll go back real quick. I know I'm circling around, but if y'all remember way back from the beginning, I said there was different sources divided ecoregions differently. This is probably one of the more intact sources, I think. This is actually was compiled by the EPA, and it's their EcoRegions Report of Texas. If you go to this website, it's actually, I think, like a 500-page report. And you can see from this map how much they divide the state up. So Gold's had 11 ecoregions. I think they have like 12 what they call level 3 ecoregions. And then they have level 5 ecoregions, which they actually divide out further, which is, if you're into this, is very neat, because then you can start seeing how, yeah, a good example would be, and I'll jump up where y'all are at. And I included in here the slides for Montgomery and Walker County. If you look, here's a map of Montgomery and Walker County. So 30, right where 34A is Houston. But you can see there's actually 3 different sub-ecoregions in Montgomery and Walker County. So this is important when you get into land management, because if you're along the Trinity River bottom, that's different than if you're in Huntsville, which is more an upland side, or compared down into southern Montgomery County, which we consider that the Flatwoods, which is very flat and low line, and some works like the Palmetto bottomlands. So like I said, I provided Michael and them these slides, and he can pass these out to y'all, but y'all can, I went into a lot of detail with these so y'all can have for y'all's references. And then just one more thing. Here's a picture again of Montgomery and Walker County from this EPA map, which shows a little bit more detail. You can actually see the brown color, which is the Blackland Prairie, coming into that western edge of Montgomery County, which I said that's really where, like, Montgomery, the town, that's where the Blackland Prairie starts. And then you can see where the Post Oak Savannah starts coming into the northwest end of Walker County. So that's that. And with that, I know it's a lot of information and I went over time, but I'll take any questions y'all have if y'all have any, and I'll be happy to answer them.
All right, thank you, Matt. If we've got our time done, so anyone that needs to go can go, but I think we have a question or comment. Now we got a lot of amazing and thank yous. So
I saw 37 in the chat. I hope that ain't 37 comments, questions.
No, it's mostly appreciation for the time you spent with us this morning. All of it is actually. So if you do have any questions, we can take those offline, and I can get them to Matt to get answers to you. We do have a copy of the slides that we will get to all of you in PDF format. So with that, just a quick reminder, 2 hours in VMS for this presentation. No walk this afternoon, so your afternoon is free for that. And we will see you. The next is a Zoom call that we have coming up on the 20th of February, 7 p.m. That's a weeknight. It's a Thursday, I believe. Tuesday, Thursday.
Yep, it's Thursday.
Thursday on geology. So with that, we will. Yeah, go
it's
ahead.
Another really great class. He does a lot of case studies at the end of it, geology case studies that are things about faulting in the area, as well as flooding and things like that. So it's really interesting.
It is. It's a good presentation. Matt, thank you. Appreciate you taking your Saturday morning.
No problem.
To be with us.
If y'all have any questions, just let Michael know. I'll be happy to answer.
Okay.